Thorstein Veblen, a very important economist in the early part of the 20th century, he noted the preeminence of Jewish scholars and scientists in Europe, and by that time, by 1930, the Jews were very prominent in the European intellectual scene, but also they had a strong tendency to be iconoclasts. That is, they tended to want to destroy, to critique the non-Jewish society. So the Enlightenment had destroyed the ability of Jewish intellectuals to find comfort in their religion. Many of these Jewish intellectuals were not religious. They'd given up, going to the synagogue and all that kind of stuff. But they were still Jewish, and they do not therefore simply accept uncritically the intellectual structures of the non-Jewish society. By engaging in iconoclasm, these Jews are in fact subjecting to criticism the basic social categorization system of the non-Jewish world, a categorization in which the Gentile but not the Jew is comfortable. And this comes right out of social identity theory. If you read texts in social identity theory, they won't talk about this, but they will talk exactly about this, that outgroups have a tendency to want to change the social categorization process of the other group. The Jew is not invested with the Gentile's particular heritage of conventional preconceptions, which have stood over by inertia of habit out of the Gentile past, things like Christian tradition, which go on one hand to make a safe and sane Gentile conservative and complacent, and which conduce also, on the other hand, to blur the safe and sane Gentile's intellectual vision, to leave him intellectually sessile. So that was his view, that Jews that weren't bound by it, they didn't have any attachment to the past. They were free to sort of come in and break it all up, be iconoclasts, not be concerned about the consequences. This is a quote from I came across very recently, a book called Jewish Eugenics by John Glad. And who is Jewish, and he has a quote from a German studies professor, Sander Gilman, who actually has made comments on my book, because he doesn't like the idea of IQ. He thinks, IQ it's just all culture and that kind of stuff. But, he's got a very strong, and when you think about someone like him, he's the paradigm, I think, of a Jewish intellectual who's very motivated by his hatred and hostility about how he interprets the past. I will no longer hear the libel of anti-Semites within the field. Again, this is somebody writing in probably just a few years ago. I reject their claim for a fair hearing within the profession because their fair hearing will be used, as it always has been, to vilify me, to dehumanize me and my pain. That's what it is. You got to deal with that. This is the reality of the intellectual world. The Holocaust remains and must remain for me the central event. It's not Bach, Beethoven, the Renaissance, or anything like that. The Holocaust is a central event of European history and of modern German culture. The event toward which every text, every moment in German history, and yes, culture, moved inexorably. I am not neutral. So in other words, Beethoven led to the Holocaust somehow. That's the idea here, that every aspect of the culture is corrupt, evil. It has to be destroyed. I'm not neutral. I'm not distant. I'm glad you missed that, because that's exactly the point of all these intellectual movements in the cultural critique. They are not distant. They are very engaged. They are very politically motivated. They want to upturn the entire intellectual world in a way that suits their interests, not necessarily ours. Serving as an outsider does not mean to be cool and clinical. It does not mean to burn with those fires that define you as an outsider. My stereotypes of the German and my awareness of them lead to me to examine the stereotypes that the German has of me. It is from this I must move. For me, it is not the age of postmodernism, it is the post-Holocaust age. That is a silent marker for our present world. And our work is to be understood, is to understand the world of the German in the light of that moment in history. And again, in the culture critique, now this of course came afterwards, but in the culture critique I talked about the Frankfurt School, and they were centrally motivated by the Holocaust, by their perception of the Holocaust. There can be no poetry after Auschwitz is a famous saying from Adorno, that this pervades Jewish intellectual movements, I think, since World War II. But again, this has been going on since before World War II. The psychoanalysis, all these things had their origins well before World War II. The Holocaust has only recently become sort of the icon of the movement of the culture of critique. Okay, another very worthwhile book to read is John Murray Cudahy. In some way, he's a real predecessor of the culture of critique. He's a sociologist at Hunter College in New York. He wrote in the 1970s. I think he's still alive, but he's very elderly now. Here's a quote from his book, The Ordeal of Civility. The basic idea of the ordeal of civility is that when Jews came out of the ghettos, and when there were so-called emancipation in the 18th century and 19th century, that they encountered this European culture that was very civil, and there was full of civility and politeness and all that kind of stuff, which they didn't really understand. I mean, it was not part of their ghetto culture. So the ordeal of civility is how Jews assimilate and adjust to this European culture of manners, politeness, and so on. So here's a classic quote, and this is cultural critique right here, sort of shorn of some of the psychology and evolutionary stuff. From Solomon Maimon to Norman Podhoretz, we've already talked about Norman Podhoretz, Rachel Varnhagen to Cynthia Ozick, from Marx and Lassalle to Irving Goffman, Harold Garfinkel, Herzl and Freud, Lasky, Trilling, just long, long list. He's just grabbing names. He could name any Jewish intellectuals he wanted. Reich 1 and 2, that refers to Wilhelm Reich, at least one of them. I don't know what the other one is, but Wilhelm Reich is the famous crazy sexologist, right? Follower of Freud, you know, had the idea of orgone boxes and all crazy stuff. One dominating structure of an identical predicament and a shared fate imposes itself on the consciousness and behavior of the Jewish intellectual in Galut, which is the Hebrew for exile, or Yiddish or something. With the advent of Jewish emancipation, when ghetto walls fall and the Städtlock, the shtetls in Eastern Europe, begin to dissolve, Jewry, like some wide-eyed anthropologist, enters upon a strange world to explore a strange people, observing a strange halakha, a strange law. They examine this world in dismay, with wonder, anger, and punitive objectivity. Punitive objectivity. They're not distant, they're angry, punitive. This wonder, this anger, this vindictive objectivity of the marginal non-member is recidivist. It keeps coming back. They continue unabated into our own time because Jewish emancipation continues into our own time. In other words, Jewish intellectuals have not altered this basic intellectual stance of punitive objectivity, the anger towards the non-Jewish society. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just go through the various chapters. So that was the first chapter, and that was sort of the theoretical introduction and how I conceptualize it. And the second chapter is about Franz Boas and the decline of social Darwinism. You know, a century ago, the social sciences were very much, well, a century ago, would have been dominated by Darwinism. You know, people like Galton, for example, you know, who talked about hereditary genius, talked about race differences, talked about you know, the basis of IQ being strongly biological and so on. All that has been lost. Why was it lost? Well, a major reason why it was lost was the movement of Franz Boas in anthropology. And the point here, though, I'm going through that, again, Jewish intellectuals have a complaint. What was Boas's complaint? Again, you have to document that he was motivated by anti-Semitism. He had, as I'm saying here, he had a strong sense that anti-Semitism pervaded non-Jewish culture, leading him to despise non-Jewish culture, particularly the culture of the Prussian aristocracy in his native Germany. There's a story about Margaret Mead, who's his disciple. She's a good example of a non-Jewish person who got involved in one of these Jewish intellectual movements. Boas was her advisor, her mentor, and so on. And she wanted to get Boas's permission to do some kind of study in Samoa or one of those places. And what she did was to try to finagle in such a way that it had something to do with how evil the Prussian aristocracy was, and he immediately went along with it. I mean, he had this hostility towards, he was born in Germany, came to America. So he was very motivated to critique, to oppose theories of culture in which cultures were ranked from low to high. So at the time, again, Darwinism was dominant. You had anthropologists who were influenced by evolutionary theory, and they had the idea that cultures went from low to high, from primitive to sort of middle level and to high. And of course, Europe was sort of at the high end of this. Boas did not like the idea of ranking cultures. He introduced the idea of cultural relativism. European culture is no better than any other culture. All cultures are equally good or whatever. And so this has had a huge effect. This is the standard wisdom now. You take a course in anthropology in America, this is the dogma that you will get. And again, it leaves out all the data showing that there are cultural differences that are important, that there are biological differences that influence behavior, that African culture is not like European culture, has not been like it, and is not likely to get there because of certain limitations, IQ and so on. The other thing is that to see the white, the idea of a homogeneous white culture as excluding Jews necessarily. Again, you have the cross on the flag. That's not something that Jews are going to resonate to. The idea that there's a sort of Christian tradition is something that, by implication, excludes Jews. So here's a comment in American Anthropology, 1997, by a Jewish anthropologist, again, very academic, high-level journal. She says the preponderance of Jewish intellectuals in the early days of Boasian anthropology and the Jewish identities of anthropologists in subsequent generations has been downplayed in standard histories of the discipline. Jewish identifications and the pursuit of perceived Jewish interests, particularly in advocating the ideology of cultural pluralism as a model for Western societies, has been the invisible project of anthropology. So these are the words of Galia Frank. In other words, anthropology since the early part of the 20th century, certainly by the 1920s, has been dominated by the idea that you should not have homogeneous Christian white culture. You should have cultural pluralism. Obviously, that would be more inclusive of Jews. It's invisible because the ethnic identifications and ethnic interests of these Jewish intellectuals have been masked by a language of science in which the identifications are not publicly legitimate. If you're a scientist, you can't go out there and say, I'm Jewish, therefore I want cultural pluralism. Instead, what you have to do is argue that these other cultures are, it's all culturally relative, it doesn't matter, that kind of thing, and not say it has nothing to do with me being Jewish, I'm just trying to find the truth. And I think people have accepted that. But again, it's apparent that there are ethnic agendas in these things. We shouldn't be surprised that there are ethnic agendas in the intellectual world any more than we're surprised to find ethnic agendas in politics.